My sister demands that I pay her child support because I am childless. My sister Lauren demanded I pay her $500 monthly as child support for my nephew Colton, because I didn't have children of my own, and therefore owed financial support to the family members who did. She actually called it a childless tax, and said since I'd selfishly chosen not to reproduce, I was obligated to financially support those who were continuing the family line. She created an official-looking document titled Child Support Agreement for Non-Parents, and tried to make me sign it at Thanksgiving dinner in front of the whole family. She said women without children had been getting away with not contributing to the next generation for too long, and it was time childless aunts paid their fair share. Lauren calculated that I should owe her $500 monthly plus back pay from when Colton was born 7 years ago, which she said totaled $42,000 in unpaid child support. She actually said she could take me to family court for abandoning my financial duties to my nephew, and any judge would side with a struggling mother over a selfish childless woman hoarding money. She told everyone at dinner that I'd been freeloading off the family by not having kids while expecting to enjoy access to Colton without paying for his upbringing. She said childless people who wanted relationships with nieces and nephews needed to pay child support, just like divorced parents did. When I laughed and said that wasn't how child support worked, Lauren said I was discriminating against parents, and this was exactly the kind of entitlement childless people showed when they refused to support the children in their lives. She said Colton was basically my part-time child since I saw him regularly and took him places, so I owed partial financial support for his existence. She actually compared herself to a surrogate who'd had a child for me since I couldn't or wouldn't have my own, and surrogates got paid, so she should too. She threatened to ban me from seeing Colton unless I started paying monthly child support immediately. Lauren had spent $8,000 on cosmetic procedures that year, but claimed she couldn't afford Colton's school supplies without my financial assistance. She said raising children was expensive, and childless people needed to understand their privilege of having disposable income came with responsibilities to family children. She actually sent me invoices for half of Colton's expenses, including his haircuts, clothes, and even his snacks, saying this was my portion of shared custody costs. She told Colton I was his financial aunt who was supposed to pay for things, but was being stingy with money that rightfully belonged to him. That's when I decided Lauren needed to learn what paying support actually meant. I started by creating my own invoices for all the babysitting I'd done over 7 years at the going rate of $20 per hour. I calculated that Lauren owed me $30,000 for unpaid childcare services that she'd been freeloading off while claiming I didn't contribute. I sent her an official-looking document titled Childcare Services Past Due, and demanded immediate payment for my labor that she'd been stealing. When Lauren said family didn't charge for babysitting, I said family didn't charge child support either, but here we were with her new rules. Next, I started demanding Lauren pay me support for everything I'd given up to be available for Colton. I billed her for missed career opportunities when I'd taken time off to watch him, lost income from leaving work early for his school events, and emotional labor compensation for dealing with his tantrums. I created spreadsheets showing she owed me $500 monthly in lifestyle support for the sacrifices I'd made to be an involved aunt. I told our family that Lauren had been exploiting my free labor for years, while contributing nothing to my life in return. For Christmas, I gave Lauren an invoice for 7 years of gifts I'd bought Colton, saying if she wanted child support, then she needed to reimburse me for all voluntary contributions I'd already made. I included every birthday present, Christmas gift, random toy, and ice cream cone I'd ever bought him with interest calculated at credit card rates. The total came to $15,000 that Lauren owed me for gifts she'd accepted without payment. I told her she couldn't have it both ways, demanding future support while keeping past contributions. The real justice came when I started telling everyone that Lauren was charging me to see my nephew like he was a rental child. I explained to our parents, relatives, and her friends that Lauren had created a pay-to-play system where family members had to pay monthly fees to have relationships with Colton. People were horrified that she was essentially selling access to her child and treating him like a subscription service. Her husband found out about the child support demands and was mortified that Lauren was trying to extort money from me using their son. Darren grabbed Lauren's arm right there in my parents' kitchen and pulled her toward the hallway where they thought nobody could hear them. His face looked like a tomato, and the vein in his forehead was sticking out like it does when he's really mad. Lauren tried to yank her arm away, but Darren held on tight and whispered something sharp that made her eyes go wide. I pretended to help Mom clear the dessert plates while everyone else suddenly found their phones super interesting, or started talking really loud about the weather. Through the doorway, I could see Lauren waving her hands around trying to explain herself, but Darren kept shaking his head and pointing toward the front door. She said something back that made him close his eyes like he was counting to 10. Then he said something that made her face go pale. They came back into the dining room, and Lauren wouldn't look at anyone while Darren told my parents they needed to leave right away because something came up. Mom looked worried and asked if everything was okay, but Darren just grabbed their coats and practically pushed Lauren out the door without even saying goodbye to Colton properly. My phone rang at 8 the next morning, and Darren's name popped up on the screen. His voice sounded rough, like he'd been awake all night and maybe crying a little. He said he was so sorry about what Lauren tried to do, and he swore on everything that he had no idea she'd been planning this crazy child support thing. He told me he stayed up until 4 in the morning going through every bank statement and credit card bill they had after I left Thanksgiving dinner. That's when he found the $8,000 in charges from that fancy cosmetic place downtown that Lauren always drives past and stares at. He said Lauren told him those charges were for Colton's school expenses and new winter clothes, but now he knew she'd been lying straight to his face for months. His voice cracked when he asked if I could send him copies of all those invoices I made, because he needed to see exactly what Lauren had been doing behind his back. I told him I'd email everything over within an hour, and he thanked me about 5 times before hanging up. 2 days later, I met Darren at the coffee shop near his office during his lunch break. He looked terrible with dark circles under his eyes, and his shirt wasn't even ironed right. I brought my laptop and pulled up all the spreadsheets I'd created showing 7 years of babysitting at $20 per hour, every birthday present, and Christmas gift with receipts. All the times I left work early to pick up Colton from the school, and the complete timeline of Lauren's demands starting from that first text message 3 months ago. Darren's hands actually shook when he scrolled through the numbers adding up to over $30,000 of free childcare and gifts I'd given them. He kept zooming in on the dates of Lauren's cosmetic procedures compared to the times she texted me saying they couldn't afford Colton's field trip fees or new shoes. He admitted he'd been picking up extra weekend shifts at the hospital for the past year because Lauren kept saying they were barely making ends meet and needed more money coming in. Now he realized all that extra money he earned went straight into Lauren's face instead of their son's needs or their savings account. He put his head in his hands and said he felt like such an idiot for not seeing what was happening right under his nose. 3 days after Thanksgiving, I was making dinner in my apartment when someone started pounding on my door hard enough to make my neighbor's dog start barking. I looked through the peephole and saw Lauren standing there with her arms crossed and her face all red and angry. I opened the door and she pushed past me into my living room without even being invited in. She started yelling about how I was trying to destroy her marriage by showing Darren private information and turning her own husband against her. I stayed calm and told her those invoices weren't private since she'd sent me official-looking documents first, so I just responded with my own official-looking documents showing what she actually owed me. She screamed that I was being petty and vindictive and I had no right to go behind her back to Darren. I said I didn't go behind her back at all because Darren called me asking questions, and I simply answered honestly with documentation. Just like she'd done to me at Thanksgiving dinner in front of the whole family, she got right in my face and said if her marriage fell apart, it would be all my fault for being a selfish witch who couldn't just help out her own sister. I looked her dead in the eye and said if showing her husband the same invoices she sent me was destroying her marriage, maybe the problem wasn't me, but the lies she'd been telling him for months. That afternoon, Mom called me crying so hard I could barely understand what she was saying at first. She finally calmed down enough to tell me Lauren had showed up at her house an hour ago, claiming I was trying to steal Colton away from her by poisoning Darren's mind with lies. Mom said Lauren kept saying I was jealous of her perfect family and trying to break them up because I was a bitter, childless woman who wanted to ruin everyone else's happiness. Mom admitted she didn't know what to believe at first because Lauren seemed so upset and convinced, but then she remembered that crazy child support document from Thanksgiving and realized Lauren wasn't making any sense. She said she loved both her daughters, but Lauren's demand for child support was completely out of line, and she couldn't support that kind of behavior no matter what. I explained to Mom that I wasn't trying to take Colton anywhere or break up Lauren's marriage. I was just refusing to pay money I didn't owe, and showing Darren the truth when he asked for it. I told her Lauren's marriage problems were her own fault for lying about money and trying to extort family members, and those were consequences of Lauren's choices, not mine. My phone buzzed with a text from Lauren later that week that was so nasty I had to read it twice to believe she actually sent it. She wrote that I was banned from seeing Colton until I apologized for destroying her marriage and agreed to pay at least $200 monthly in aunt support as compromise. She said if I really loved my nephew, I'd be willing to help support him financially, instead of being a greedy witch hoarding my money. She called me selfish about 10 times in one paragraph and said Colton deserved better than an aunt who valued money over family. I took a screenshot of the whole message and forwarded it straight to Darren without adding any comment of my own. He texted back in less than 5 minutes saying Lauren didn't get to decide who saw Colton by herself, and she definitely couldn't ban me from my nephew's life over refusing to pay made-up fees. He said he was planning to bring Colton to visit me this Saturday, no matter what Lauren said, because I was family, and Colton loved spending time with me. Saturday morning, Darren showed up at my apartment with Colton, who ran inside and gave me a big hug like always. But then he pulled back and looked up at me with these sad, confused eyes and asked why Mommy kept saying I didn't want to help take care of him anymore. My stomach dropped and I felt sick realizing Lauren had been telling Colton that I was abandoning him. I knelt down so we were eye level and told him I loved him more than anything, and I would always be his aunt no matter what. I explained that grown-ups don't charge each other money to be family, because that's not how love works, and Mommy had gotten confused about how family relationships are supposed to work. I said sometimes adults make mistakes and say things that aren't true when they're upset, but none of this was his fault, and nothing would ever change how much I cared about him. He hugged me again and seemed to feel better, then asked if we could go to the park like we used to. I took Colton to the park down the street while Darren stayed at my apartment to make some phone calls. We sat on the swings and Colton started talking about how Mommy and Daddy had been fighting a lot at home lately. He said he could hear them arguing at night after he went to bed, and it scared him because they never used to fight like that before. He told me Mommy kept saying I was selfish and mean, but he didn't understand why because I'd always been nice to him and took him fun places and bought him ice cream. I pushed his swing gently and promised him that the grown-ups were working through some problems that had nothing to do with him and weren't his responsibility to fix. I told him that no matter what happened between the grown-ups, I would always love him and want to spend time with him because he was my favorite nephew in the whole world. He smiled a little at that and said I was his favorite aunt, which made sense since I was his only aunt, and we both laughed. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, this woman named Haley said she was Lauren's best friend, and she really needed to talk to me about everything that had been going on. We agreed to meet for lunch at this sandwich place halfway between our apartments. Haley seemed nervous when she sat down and started by saying she'd heard Lauren's side of the story, but also talked to my mom and some other family members, and now she was really concerned about Lauren. She admitted that Lauren had been complaining to her for months about this childless tax idea, but Haley thought it was just venting about feeling stressed with money. She said she never imagined Lauren would actually try to make me sign documents and demand real money from me. After hearing what really happened at Thanksgiving and seeing how Lauren was acting now, Haley said she was genuinely worried that Lauren had lost touch with what was reasonable behavior and what was completely out of line. Haley leaned forward and told me things about Lauren that I didn't know. She said Lauren had been spending hours every day on social media comparing herself to other mothers who seemed to have perfect lives and perfect families and perfect faces. Lauren started buying expensive clothes and booking cosmetic procedures to try to look like those women online, and she was spending way more money than she and Darren actually had. Haley said Lauren had borrowed money from her, and at least 2 other friends over the past year, always claiming Darren was being cheap with household money, and she needed help covering basic expenses for Colton. But now Haley realized Lauren had been lying about their financial situation the whole time and using borrowed money to fund her image instead of her son's needs. Haley looked really sad when she said she loved Lauren like a sister, but she couldn't support her trying to extort family members for money. And she honestly thought Lauren needed professional help to deal with her spending addiction and her warped sense of entitlement about what other people owed her. I thanked Haley for being honest with me and told her I hoped Lauren would get the help she needed. After we finished lunch, I sat in my car for a while thinking about everything Haley had said about Lauren's social media obsession and her lies to friends about needing money. It made me sad to realize my sister had gotten so lost in comparing herself to fake, perfect lives online that she'd convinced herself she deserved money from everyone around her. But I also knew that wasn't my problem to fix, and Lauren needed to face the consequences of her choices before she'd ever change. The first Sunday in December rolled around, and my parents hosted their regular family dinner like they did every week. I showed up with a casserole dish wondering if Lauren would even be there, or if she'd skip to avoid seeing me. She came with Darren and Colton, but the second she walked in and saw me setting food on the dining room table, her whole face changed. She grabbed a chair at the far end of the table as far from me as possible, and made sure Colton sat between her and Darren like she needed a buffer. Throughout dinner, she kept making these pointed comments about how some people cared more about money than family bonds, and how selfish individuals always put themselves first. She said it was sad when people forgot that family was supposed to support each other through hard times instead of keeping score. My mom tried to change the subject by asking Colton about school, but Lauren just kept going, saying out loud to no one in particular that she couldn't believe how cold some people could be to their own flesh and blood. Dad set his fork down hard enough that it clanked against his plate and everyone went quiet. He looked directly at Lauren and said she needed to stop playing the victim right now because she was the one who made this whole situation about money by demanding I pay her child support. His voice was firm and tired at the same time as he told her she'd created this mess with her ridiculous demands and her manipulation, and now she needed to take responsibility instead of acting like everyone else was the problem. Lauren's mouth dropped open like she couldn't believe Dad was calling her out in front of everyone. She started to say something, but Dad held up his hand and said he wasn't finished talking. He told Lauren that her behavior toward me had been cruel and unfair, and he was done watching her try to guilt-trip me for having boundaries. The tension in the room got so thick I could barely breathe, and then Colton started crying at the table because the adults were fighting. Darren immediately stood up and took Colton outside to the backyard, while the rest of us sat there in awful silence. Mom reached over and put her hand on Lauren's arm and said they needed to have an honest conversation about what had been happening. Her voice was shaky, but determined as she admitted she'd been enabling Lauren's victim mentality for years because it was easier than confronting her. She said watching Lauren try to manipulate me and poison Colton against me had finally opened her eyes to how unhealthy the family dynamics had become. Dad nodded and said he and Mom had talked about this situation a lot over the past 2 weeks, and they'd decided they weren't going to referee this conflict anymore or pressure me to give in just to keep the peace. Mom looked right at Lauren and told her that the child support demand was ridiculous, that her treatment of me had been cruel, and that she needed to take responsibility for her choices instead of blaming everyone else for her problems. She said Lauren's spending habits and entitlement issues were hers to deal with, and the family couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. Lauren's face went red and then white, and she pushed her chair back so hard it scraped across the floor. She started yelling that the whole family had turned against her and taken my side without even trying to understand her perspective. She said we were all going to regret this, and that she'd never forget how we ganged up on her when she was struggling. She stomped toward the back door, calling for Darren and Colton and saying they were leaving right now. Darren came back inside looking exhausted and defeated, and gathered up Colton's jacket without saying anything. Lauren was already out the front door screaming back at us that we'd all chosen sides and destroyed the family. The door slammed and we heard their car start up and drive away. Mom put her face in her hands and started crying these quiet sobs that made her whole body shake. Dad moved his chair closer and wrapped his arms around her, and they just sat there holding each other, looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen them look before. I felt this heavy guilt settling in my chest, even though I knew logically that I hadn't started this conflict, and I hadn't demanded anything unreasonable. Lauren had created this whole mess, but somehow I still felt responsible for my parents sitting there crying and my family falling apart. Around 11 that night, my phone buzzed with a text from Darren saying Lauren had locked herself in their bedroom the second they got home and wouldn't speak to him or come out. He said he'd tried talking to her through the door, but she just kept yelling that everyone hated her, and nobody understood what she was going through. His text said he'd reached his breaking point with her refusal to acknowledge reality or take accountability for anything she'd done. He wrote that he was going to insist on marriage counseling and financial counseling, and if Lauren wouldn't agree to both, then he was prepared to separate, because he couldn't raise Colton in an environment full of manipulation and manufactured drama. He said he was sorry for everything Lauren had put me through, and he hoped our family could eventually heal from all this damage. I texted back thanking him for being reasonable and telling him I hoped things would work out, but that I understood if he needed to make hard choices to protect himself and Colton. The week before Christmas, Darren showed up at my parents' house with Colton and 2 suitcases asking if they could stay in the guest room for a while. Mom immediately said yes and helped them get settled while Dad and I exchanged worried looks in the living room. Darren explained that he'd told Lauren he was moving out temporarily until she agreed to get professional help, and Lauren had completely lost it. He said she'd screamed at him for hours about abandoning her and choosing everyone else over his own wife. Within an hour of Darren and Colton arriving at my parents' house, my phone started ringing with Lauren's number. I answered, and she immediately started screaming so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. She yelled that I'd destroyed her family and stolen her husband and son from her. She said I'd turned everyone against her and poisoned Darren's mind, and now I'd gotten exactly what I wanted, which was to ruin her life. She was crying and screaming at the same time, asking how I could do this to her and why I hated her so much. I stayed calm and told her that Darren had made his own choice based on her behavior and not anything I'd done. I said she was welcome to fix her marriage anytime she wanted by actually addressing her spending problem and entitlement issues, instead of blaming everyone else for the consequences of her own actions. She called me every horrible name she could think of and then hung up on me. Christmas Eve arrived, and I was at my parents' house helping Mom set up for our small celebration when the doorbell rang. Dad went to answer it, and there was Lauren on the front porch demanding to see Colton. Her voice carried through the whole house as she said we were all guilty of parental alienation, and she was going to call the police if we didn't let her see her son immediately. She was yelling about her rights as a mother and accusing us of kidnapping Colton and turning him against her. Dad stood firm in the doorway, blocking her from coming inside, and told her in this steady voice that she was absolutely welcome to visit Colton, but not if she was going to create a scene or say bad things about family members in front of her son. He said if she could calm down and act like a reasonable adult, then she could come in and spend time with Colton for Christmas Eve. Lauren's face crumpled and she started crying right there on the porch, and for the first time since this whole thing started, her tears looked real instead of manipulative. Her shoulders shook and she covered her face with her hands, sobbing like something inside her had finally broken. Mom came to the door and gently touched Dad's arm and then stepped past him onto the porch. She put her hand on Lauren's back and said softly that Lauren should come inside and have some tea and talk for a bit. Lauren nodded without looking up and let Mom guide her into the house. Mom took her to the kitchen and closed the door while the rest of us gave them space. I could hear their voices through the door but couldn't make out words, and I kept myself busy helping Colton decorate cookies in the dining room. After about an hour, Mom came out of the kitchen looking drained but slightly hopeful. She said Lauren had agreed to see a therapist and attend financial counseling if Darren would consider coming home. She said Lauren finally admitted she had a problem and needed help. Lauren followed Mom out of the kitchen a minute later, looking smaller somehow, like she'd shrunk into herself. Her eyes were red and puffy, and when she glanced at me across the room, she just looked away quickly, instead of glaring or saying something mean. Darren came downstairs and Mom quietly told him what Lauren had agreed to, and asked if he'd be willing to talk with her. He looked at Lauren for a long moment and then said he'd come home with Colton after the holidays were over, but only if Lauren actually followed through with therapy and counseling. He said he also needed her to write me a real apology for everything she'd done. Lauren nodded without arguing, and her face stayed down like she couldn't meet anyone's eyes. Mom said she was going to take Lauren to her house for a longer private talk, and they left together through the front door. After they'd gone, Dad came over and put his hand on my shoulder and told me he was proud of how I'd handled this whole situation with dignity and clear boundaries. He said he was sorry it took Lauren having a complete breakdown for him and Mom to finally stop enabling her dysfunction, and he wished they'd stood up to her behavior years ago before it got this bad. The middle of January came and I found an envelope in my mailbox with Lauren's handwriting on it. Inside was a letter written on regular notebook paper, and I could see where she'd crossed out words and rewritten sentences multiple times. There were spots on the paper that looked like tear stains making the ink run in places. The letter said she was sorry for demanding child support from me, and sorry for trying to manipulate me and the whole family. She wrote that she'd been struggling with feeling like she wasn't good enough compared to all the mothers she saw online who seemed to have perfect lives and perfect faces and perfect everything. She admitted that spending $8,000 on cosmetic procedures while claiming she couldn't afford Colton's school supplies was wrong and hypocritical. She said her therapist was helping her understand that she'd been trying to control other people because she felt so out of control in her own life. She wrote that she knew she'd hurt me and damaged our relationship, and she understood if I needed time and space before I could trust her again. She asked if we could maybe slowly try to rebuild some kind of relationship for Colton's sake, because he missed me and kept asking when he could see me again. The letter ended with her saying she knew actions mattered more than words, and she was going to work on being the kind of person who deserved to have family relationships. I sat at my kitchen table reading the letter 3 times trying to figure out how I felt about it. Part of me was relieved that Lauren finally seemed to understand what she'd done wrong. Another part of me was still angry and hurt and worried this was just another manipulation. I decided to respond, but to be honest about my boundaries and expectations. I wrote my own letter telling Lauren I appreciated her apology, and I was glad she was getting help. I said I was willing to work on rebuilding our relationship, but I needed to see consistent changed behavior over time, and not just nice words on paper. I made it very clear that I would never pay her any form of child support, or aunt tax, or any other made-up fee she might think of in the future. I wrote that any relationship going forward required her respecting my boundaries and my choices about my own life, without guilt trips or manipulation. I also told her that my relationship with Colton mattered to me, and I hoped we could find a way to exist as family without all the financial demands and drama. I mailed the letter the next day and felt like maybe there was a tiny chance things could eventually get better, even if they'd never be the same as before. I decided to wait a few weeks before reaching out to anyone about Lauren's progress. I wanted to see if her apology and promises were real, or just another attempt to manipulate the situation. Haley texted me in early February asking if I'd heard from Lauren lately. I told her about the letter and my response, and Haley said she'd been meeting Lauren for coffee every Thursday morning before work. Lauren was actually showing up to her therapy appointments and doing the homework her therapist assigned. Haley said Lauren had deleted her Instagram account completely and removed the Facebook app from her phone after her therapist helped her see how much time she spent comparing herself to other people's fake perfect lives. Lauren was using a basic budgeting app now and tracking every dollar she spent, which was apparently really hard for her at first, because she'd never paid attention to where money actually went. Darren had taken over their credit cards temporarily, and Lauren was using cash envelopes for groceries and household expenses, so she could physically see how much she had left each week. Haley admitted she was surprised Lauren was sticking with it, because she'd expected Lauren to quit therapy after a few sessions, like she'd quit everything else that felt uncomfortable. I told Haley I hoped Lauren kept it up, but I wasn't ready to trust that the changes would last. Mom called me that same week to tell me she and Dad had gone to one of Lauren and Darren's counseling sessions as guests. The therapist had asked Lauren's permission to invite them so they could understand what Lauren was working on and how they could support healthier family patterns. Mom said it was hard to hear the therapist explain how she and Dad had been enabling Lauren's behavior by always bailing her out financially and smoothing over conflicts instead of letting Lauren face consequences. The therapist told them that giving Lauren money whenever she claimed to be struggling had actually prevented her from learning to manage her own finances and make hard choices about priorities. Mom cried when she realized that trying to help Lauren had actually hurt her ability to grow up and take responsibility for her life. Dad apparently sat there looking uncomfortable the whole time, but admitted at the end that the therapist was right about them making excuses for Lauren's bad behavior. Mom said they'd agreed to stop giving Lauren money for anything except true emergencies, and to let her work through her problems without jumping in to fix everything. The middle of March arrived and I got a text from Lauren asking if I'd meet her for coffee on Saturday morning. My first thought was to say no because I still felt hurt and angry about everything that had happened. But I also knew that if I wanted any chance of having a relationship with Colton as he grew up, I needed to at least try to see if Lauren had actually changed. I texted back that I'd meet her at the coffee shop near my apartment at 10. I showed up 5 minutes early and sat at a table in the back corner where we could talk without being overheard. Lauren walked in right at 10 looking different from I'd seen her in months. She wasn't wearing makeup, and her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, instead of the styled waves she usually spent an hour creating. She was wearing jeans and a regular t-shirt instead of the designer clothes she used to insist on buying even when she claimed they couldn't afford groceries. She sat down across from me and ordered a regular coffee instead of the $7 fancy drink she used to get every single day. We sat there in awkward silence for a minute before Lauren started talking. She said her therapist had been helping her understand that her child support demand came from feeling like she was failing at being a mom, compared to all the perfect mothers she saw online. She'd been spending hours every day scrolling through social media, looking at women who seemed to have everything together. Perfect houses and perfect kids and perfect faces and perfect lives. She started believing that if she just looked better and bought the right things and presented the right image, she'd feel like a good mother instead of feeling like she was drowning. She admitted she'd been so focused on appearing successful that she'd stopped actually being present with Colton or paying attention to what he needed. She said when she saw me living my life without kids and having money to spend on whatever I wanted, she felt angry and jealous instead of happy for me. She'd convinced herself that I owed her something because I'd chosen not to have the struggles she was dealing with. Her therapist helped her see that she was trying to control me and punish me for having a different life, instead of dealing with her own feelings about her choices. I sat there listening to Lauren and trying to figure out if this was genuine or another manipulation. I told her I understood feeling overwhelmed by life choices and comparing yourself to other people. I said everyone struggles with feeling like they're not measuring up to some impossible standard. But I also told her that trying to force me to pay for her decisions was never going to work, and it had seriously damaged our relationship. I explained that I needed her to understand that I'm Colton's aunt who loves him and wants to spend time with him. But I'm not a bank account for her to withdraw from whenever she feels stressed about money. I said if we were going to rebuild any kind of relationship, She needed to respect my boundaries and my choices about my own life, without guilt trips or demands or manipulation. Lauren nodded and said her therapist had been working with her on understanding the difference between asking for help appropriately and making demands with threats attached. She admitted she'd been using Colton as a weapon to try to control me, and that was wrong and unfair to him. She said she was learning to communicate what she actually needed instead of creating drama and making ultimatums. We talked for almost 2 hours about how we could move forward. I made it very clear that I would never pay her any form of child support or aunt tax or any other made-up fee, no matter what she called it. I told her I was happy to spend time with Colton and occasionally buy him things because I wanted to, not because I owed her anything. Lauren agreed and said she understood that gifts and time with family weren't things she could demand or put a price on. We decided we'd start slowly with family gatherings where other people were around and see how things went before trying to rebuild a closer relationship. It wasn't comfortable and it wasn't like it used to be between us, but it felt more honest than our relationship had been in years. Spring came and the weather got warmer and life settled into a new normal with Lauren. We saw each other at Mom and Dad's house for Sunday dinners, and we were polite and civil without the constant tension that had made every family gathering miserable for months. I started seeing Colton again regularly, picking him up on Saturday afternoons to go to the park or get ice cream or just hang out at my apartment playing games. Lauren still had moments where I could see her old patterns trying to come back. She'd make a comment about how nice it must be to afford new furniture, or mention how expensive Colton's summer camp was going to be. But then she'd catch herself and apologize for trying to make me feel guilty about my money. Her therapist had apparently taught her to recognize when she was falling back into old behaviors, and to stop herself before she damaged relationships again. Darren told me privately that things were better at home than they'd been in years, because Lauren was actually talking about her feelings instead of spending money to avoid dealing with them. Mom said she and Dad were learning to let Lauren handle her own problems instead of always trying to fix things for her. Our whole family was figuring out that keeping peace by ignoring bad behavior just made everything worse over time. I watched Lauren work hard in therapy and marriage counseling and actually change her patterns, and I felt genuinely proud of her for doing something that was obviously difficult and uncomfortable. Our relationship would never be what it was before all this happened. We'd never be as close as we were when we were younger and trusted each other completely. But what we had now was healthier and more real than what we'd had before, even if it wasn't as easy or comfortable. I learned that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone you love is refuse to participate in their dysfunction and let them face the consequences of their choices. Lauren learned that trying to control other people and avoid her own feelings only made her more miserable and damaged the relationships she actually cared about. And Colton got to grow up watching the adults in his life work through hard problems and come out better on the other side, which seemed like a pretty valuable lesson for a kid to learn.